Well, hello, everybody. I'm really delighted to be speaking to you today and to be speaking with Susannah and Randy as well, because I'm sure everybody's going to get a nice, wide range of presentations and of research ideas. Today, I'm going to talk about some research that we've done looking at the size and shape and number and condition of modern-day forests in the eastern U.S., and then tell you about some research we're doing on invasive plants and ticks in some of those forests. So, what changes have we made to the landscape? This is my photoshopped version of what you would see from a satellite view about 400 years ago of the greater Philadelphia region. That's obviously 400 years ago is a very short time in a lot of senses, not on a human scale, but in a lot of other ways. And back then, pretty much what you had was a landscape of forests. The temperate deciduous biome is a place where if you don't do anything, and if you leave the land alone, a lot of it's going to go to forest. But we have not left it alone. About 400 years ago, European settlers came over, and over the next 250 years, they pretty much cut down all of this at one time or another. And then, starting about 100 years ago, as farming began to move west, forest was allowed to grow back in areas that had not already been paved or covered over with some other impervious surface. So this is what that same view looks like today. And I just think it is really amazing how much non-forest there is. And I think Susannah is going to talk more about that later when she gives her presentation. The French demographer Jean Gottman wrote about some of those changes and about our use of forests in this sort of landmark book called Megalopolis, which is a great title. I love that word. And he wrote about this sort of mega city that had formed between Boston and Washington, D.C. And he saw that, areas, even then he saw that areas that were being farmed in 1937, this is an actual aerial view in 1937, those same places were covered with either trees or roads or, forests where the farming had been abandoned. All right, so here's a sort of big picture view of forests in this megalopolis region today. There are about 250,000 forests. Our definition of a forest was, natural woodlands that were more than 1 hectare in size. So there are about 250,000 forests like that. But the interesting thing is that about 92 or 93% of them are small. About 90, well, most of them are about the size of a large suburban lot, and all the rest are really, most of them are below the size of a gigantic parking lot that you'd have in a mall or something like that. This area that's shown here in the map is only about 2% of the U.S. land area, but it's got 17% of the population, which is 52 million people. This is just another way of looking at that. This is the landscape reduced down to nothing except forests. So to kind of give you an idea of what forests look like on the landscape right now. And you can see there's a lot of specks of black. Those are smaller than 50 hectares. And then there's far fewer, but they are larger, that are larger than 50 hectares. So you see quite a bit of green. Those are forests that are larger than 50 hectares. But you see many more in number that are smaller. And I think it's important to point out that this is really the experience that most people have with a forest these days, because these are the small forests that are in people's neighborhoods. And we're really interested in those forests. We call them forests among managed ecosystems, and that is the group of words that gives the acronym frame to a project that we're doing to look at the conditions and some ecological networks within those forests. This is something that we started with a group of researchers about 10 years ago, and in fact, Susannah, who's going to be talking, is part of that group now. So for this project, we selected a number. Currently, it is 50 forests scattered throughout the megalopolis, and we have collected really a tremendous amount of data across all the different trophic levels. In other words, everything from the ground through things like arthropods and reptiles and amphibians, birds, mammals, up to the canopy of the forest to try to understand what's going on inside these small forests. And one of the things that we've found is that there is a big problem with non-native invasive plants in the understories of these forests. I don't think that's a surprise to many people that are listening right now. And of those invaders, the worst, at least in the forest that we've studied so far, is multiflora rose. Here's a group of the forests that are part of this frame network. And you can see just in this selection of forests that, first of all, that a lot of them have multiflora rose that's in the understory. And you can also see that it ranges all the way from very little. So the upper left-hand corner, you're seeing one of our forests, which has very, very little multiflora rose in it. And it ranges from that all the way to the bottom right corner, where the forest, almost the entire understory, is multiflora rose. And let me tell you, it's not a nice place to do field work. So you would not necessarily connect this finding with Lyme disease, but there has been work on non-native invasive plants and ticks and your risk of Lyme disease, and this was work that we decided to expand to this very large network of forests to look at how something like, invasion from non-native understory plants might affect people's risk. And part of this was, I'm often asked, why should we spend, the money that we have to spend to control non-native invasive plants? I am asked that quite often, and usually it's because, time and money for the people that are charged with managing our land is limited. So I just thought, well, this might be something that would be interesting for people that are wondering if it makes any difference, in our risk of something like Lyme disease if we control some of these non-native plants. So one thing that we needed to do to explore this question was to catch a lot of mice, and those are one of the main hosts of ticks that are also reservoirs for the Borrelia burgdorferi. That's the bacteria that causes Lyme disease. So we went throughout these forests with various ranges of non-native plant invasion, and we caught a lot of mice. And birds function somewhat differently, although some of them are also reservoirs for Lyme disease. They also move ticks around. So we also caught a lot of birds, especially the kinds of birds that forage on the ground, because those are the ones that are most often hosts for ticks. And what we found was surprising and a somewhat complex story, but I think we have enough time. It looks pretty good that I can give you the main idea. We found that there are fewer ticks in forests that are heavily invaded by non-native invasive plants. And my last slide, I think, is going to show you, a possible reason for that. But I will tell you right away that it involves leaf litter. Invaded forests usually have much less leaf litter on the ground than other forests, and there's quite a few reasons for that. But it's something that we've seen very clearly. Ticks need leaf litter to stay hydrated. They usually go under the leaf litter, the ticks that cause Lyme disease anyway. So not having a lot of leaf litter in these invaded understories may have affected the ability of ticks to survive there. We also collected those ticks and we tested them for the kinds of organisms that cause diseases in people. And what we found was that most ticks are not carrying pathogens for people. That's not a surprise. It's only about 10% or so. Of those 10% that carry disease-causing organisms, most of them carry Borrelia burgdorferi, which is the bacteria that causes Lyme disease, and a few carry some other diseases. But here's sort of the interesting part where non-native invasive plants come back as not a positive thing. We found that ticks that you collect in areas that are invaded by non-native invasive plants are more likely to be carrying disease. And if you want me to speculate as to why that is, then I can tell you that we've looked at some of the data and discussed this. And we think that since some of the reservoirs for Lyme disease, like mice, that are very good at kind of giving the tick the disease, those hosts need a lot of ground cover to protect themselves from predators. And multiflora rose makes very good cover for a mouse because it can be pretty nasty stuff, but mice don't have any trouble getting through it. So if you have more mice in areas that are invaded, then the mice are going to be the hosts for your ticks. And mice are very good, as I said, at infecting ticks with the same bacteria that will give you Lyme disease. So that might be that where you have invasion, that might be the reason that where you have invasion, you also have more disease in the ticks. So I thought from my last slide I would just show you a relationship between leaf litter and non-native plants that we've seen that explains one of those earlier findings I showed you. Those gray dots you see going from high level to a low level, and that's the amount of leaf litter in our forests. Each of these dots represents a forest. So when you look at this, you see that line sort of going downward from left to right, more leaf litter to less leaf litter. But when you look at the non-native plants, the number of non-native plants in our understory, they really follow the opposite trend. So when you have very few non-native plants, you probably have a lot of leaf litter. And when you have a lot of non-native plants, you have less leaf litter, which, like I said, the ticks need to survive. So that's my presentation for today, and I guess it's time for me to turn it over to Susannah.